August 21st, 1942. The jungle of Guadalcanal lay thick and suffocating under the Pacific moon, every vine and branch dripping with moisture that seemed to carry the weight of impending death. Marine Sergeant Bill Henderson crouched behind a hastily constructed barricade of sandbags and fallen logs, his hands gripping the pump-action Winchester M1897 shotgun that had become his most trusted companion in this green hell. The weapon's steel barrel gleamed dully in the filtered moonlight, its smooth walnut stock worn smooth by countless training sessions back at Camp Pendleton. Around him, 24 Marines waited in absolute silence, their faces blackened with mud and camouflage paint, eyes straining to penetrate the impenetrable darkness of the jungle that stretched endlessly beyond their perimeter. The heat was unbearable, even at night. Sweat rolled down Henderson's face and neck, mixing with the constant buzz of mosquitoes and the acidic smell of rotting vegetation that permeated every breath. His uniform clung to his body like a second skin, heavy with moisture and the grime of weeks spent fighting for control of this strategic island that neither side could afford to lose. The Marine positions were a maze of foxholes, sandbag emplacements, and improvised firing positions carved from the jungle floor, each one designed to channel advancing enemy forces into predetermined killing zones where American firepower could be concentrated with devastating effect. Intelligence reports had warned that the Japanese were planning another massive night assault, their signature tactic for breaking American defensive lines through sheer audacity and fanatical courage. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, hundreds of Imperial Japanese Army soldiers were preparing for what they believed would be the decisive attack that would drive the Americans back into the sea and secure Guadalcanal for the Emperor. They had been trained to charge with fixed bayonets, to overwhelm enemy positions through spiritual strength and martial prowess, to die gloriously rather than accept defeat. Their officers had assured them that American soldiers, raised in soft democratic society, would break and run when confronted with the pure fighting spirit of the Japanese warrior. The Marines knew better. They had been fighting on Guadalcanal for weeks, learning harsh lessons about jungle warfare, night combat, and the desperate ferocity of an enemy who preferred death to dishonor. They had discovered that rifles, with their long barrels and precise ammunition, were often less effective than expected in the close-quarters fighting that characterized Pacific jungle combat. Machine guns jammed from humidity and dirt. Mortars were difficult to aim accurately in dense vegetation, and hand-to-hand combat favored the enemy's superior training in bayonet fighting and martial arts. But they had also discovered something else, something that would change the nature of jungle warfare forever. But what happens when a desperate charge meets the thunder of American shotguns? The Guadalcanal campaign represented the first major Allied offensive operation in the Pacific theater, marking the transition from desperate defense to systematic counterattack against Japanese expansion across the Pacific Islands. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal lay in its location along the sea routes connecting the United States and Australia, making it essential for maintaining Allied supply lines and preventing Japanese forces from cutting off Australia from American support. More immediately, the island's Henderson Field Airstrip provided a crucial base for Allied air operations against Japanese shipping and naval forces operating throughout the Solomon Islands chain. Control of Guadalcanal would determine whether the Pacific War remained a defensive struggle or became an offensive campaign aimed at rolling back Japanese conquests. Japanese military doctrine in the Pacific had been built around the concept of night attacks and close-quarters combat, tactics that had proven devastatingly effective during the initial phases of Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Imperial Japanese Army training emphasized bayonet fighting, hand-to-hand combat, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors over Western soldiers who were supposedly corrupted by democratic weakness and material comfort. Japanese officers believed that aggressive night assaults, supported by artillery and coordinated with naval bombardment, could break any enemy defense through sheer audacity and willingness to accept casualties that Western armies would find unacceptable. The reality of jungle combat in the Solomon Islands challenged many assumptions about modern warfare that had been developed during the European conflicts of World War I and the early phases of World War II. Dense vegetation, limited visibility to just a few yards in most areas, making long-range rifle fire ineffective and reducing most engagements to close-quarters encounters where speed and firepower were more important than accuracy and tactical sophistication. Traditional military doctrine emphasized coordinated movement and supporting fires, but jungle conditions often isolated individual soldiers and small units who had to fight independently without the benefit of artillery support or tactical coordination with adjacent units. American forces arriving at Guadalcanal initially carried standard infantry weapons, M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and Thompson submachine guns that had been designed for European-style warfare where engagement ranges were measured in hundreds of yards and tactical situations developed over extended time periods. These weapons, while excellent for their intended purposes, proved less suitable for the immediate close-range encounters that characterized Pacific jungle fighting. The M1 Garand, in particular, with its 8-round clips and semi-automatic action, was optimized for accuracy at medium to long range, but offered limited advantages in jungle fighting, where most encounters occurred at ranges under 50 yards. The introduction of shotguns into American Pacific operations reflected practical adaptation to combat conditions rather than strategic planning or doctrinal development. The Winchester M1897 and M1912 pump-action shotguns had been used extensively during World War I trench warfare, where their devastating close-range firepower had proven effective against German stormtrooper assaults and raiding parties. These weapons, originally designed for civilian hunting and sport shooting, were modified for military use with shorter barrels, bayonet lugs, and heat shields that allowed sustained firing without burning the operator's hands. Most importantly, they fired 12-gauge shells loaded with 9 .33 caliber lead pellets that spread into a deadly pattern at close range. The tactical advantages of shotguns in jungle warfare were immediately apparent to Marines who had experience with these weapons from civilian hunting or military training. Unlike rifles, which required precise aim at specific targets, shotguns delivered multiple projectiles in a spreading pattern that made hits probable even when visibility was limited and targets were partially concealed by vegetation. The psychological impact was equally significant. The thunderous blast of a 12-gauge shell and the immediate devastating effect on targets created shock and fear among enemy forces who had not encountered such weapons in previous combat operations. Japanese military intelligence had limited knowledge of American shotgun capabilities, having focused their weapons analysis on standard infantry arms like rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces. Imperial Army training manuals made no mention of shotgun tactics or countermeasures, leaving Japanese soldiers unprepared for the psychological and physical impact of multiple projectiles striking simultaneously. The Japanese military culture, which emphasized individual courage and martial skill, had difficulty comprehending weapons that were designed to be effective regardless of the operator's marksmanship ability or tactical sophistication. The distribution of shotguns among American forces reflected practical needs rather than systematic supply planning, with many weapons being acquired through informal channels or modified from civilian sporting models. Marine units often received shotguns as personal weapons carried by individual soldiers who had civilian hunting experience, while others were distributed based on specific tactical requirements for jungle fighting, bunker clearing, and close-quarters combat operations. This informal distribution system meant that shotgun availability varied significantly between units, with some Marines carrying multiple shotguns while others relied entirely on conventional infantry weapons. American tactical doctrine gradually evolved to incorporate shotguns as specialized weapons for specific combat situations rather than general-purpose infantry arms. Marines learned to position shotgun-armed soldiers at critical points in defensive perimeters where Japanese night attacks were most likely to achieve breakthrough, creating concentrated firepower that could stop attacking forces before they reached hand-to-hand combat range. The weapons proved particularly effective when combined with other close-quarters weapons, like Thompson submachine guns and M1 carbines, creating layered defensive fires that could engage attacking forces at multiple ranges simultaneously. The psychological warfare implications of shotgun use became apparent as reports of their effectiveness spread through both American and Japanese forces in the Pacific theater. American morale improved significantly as Marines gained confidence in their ability to stop Japanese night attacks and banzai charges using weapons that provided immediate, visible results against attacking forces. Conversely, Japanese morale suffered as survivors of shotgun encounters reported the devastating and seemingly unfair nature of weapons that could kill multiple soldiers with a single shot, challenging traditional Japanese concepts of honorable combat and individual martial prowess. The attack began at 0247 hours with the distinctive whistle of Japanese artillery shells arcing through the humid night air, followed by explosions that lit up the jungle canopy with brief, hellish flashes of orange and white light. Marine positions along the perimeter absorbed the bombardment with practiced stoicism, soldiers pressing themselves into foxholes and behind sandbag barriers while shrapnel whistled overhead and palm fronds rained down like confetti from a deadly celebration. Sergeant Henderson felt the familiar tightness in his stomach that preceded combat, his hands automatically checking the Winchester's action one final time before the real shooting began. 6 shells loaded, safety off, stock firmly seated against his shoulder. Everything was ready for what promised to be another desperate night battle for control of Henderson Field and the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. The artillery barrage lasted exactly 10 minutes, time to suppress American defensive fires without giving the Marines enough time to call for counter-battery support from their own guns positioned deeper in the jungle. As the last explosions echoed through the trees, an eerie silence descended over the battlefield, broken only by the crackling of small fires started by the bombardment and the occasional groan of wounded men calling for medics. Henderson strained his eyes against the darkness, searching for movement in the vegetation that stretched endlessly beyond the American perimeter. His finger rested lightly on the shotgun's trigger, muscles tensed for the moment when Japanese infantry would emerge from the jungle to begin their assault on positions that both sides knew would determine the fate of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The first indication of the approaching assault came not through sight, but through sound. A low chanting that seemed to rise from the earth itself, growing louder and more distinct as hundreds of Japanese voices joined together in what Henderson recognized as the traditional battle cry that preceded banzai charges. Tenohaka banzai, long live the emperor, echoed through the jungle as Imperial Army soldiers worked themselves into the spiritual frenzy that Japanese military doctrine taught would overcome any material disadvantage through sheer force of will and dedication to their divine ruler. The chanting was accompanied by the metallic scraping of bayonets being fixed to rifle barrels and the soft rustle of equipment as hundreds of soldiers prepared to charge across the killing ground that separated the opposing forces. The assault, when it came, was unlike anything in Henderson's previous combat experience. Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle like a human wave, their bayonet-tipped rifles gleaming in the moonlight as they ran directly toward American positions with complete disregard for casualties or tactical formations. They came in groups of 20 or 30, spread across the entire perimeter, screaming at the top of their lungs and firing wildly as they closed the distance to the marine foxholes. Their courage was undeniable, but Henderson could see that their tactics were designed for psychological impact rather than military effectiveness. They were counting on American soldiers to break and run when confronted with what appeared to be a suicidal assault by warriors who preferred death to defeat. Henderson's first shot came when the lead Japanese soldiers were barely 30 yards from his position, close enough that he could see individual faces twisted with combat fury and determination. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder with a roar that seemed to silence the jungle itself, 9 .33 caliber lead pellets spreading into a deadly pattern that caught 3 charging soldiers simultaneously. The effect was immediate and devastating. All 3 men went down as if they had run into an invisible wall, their weapons flying from nerveless hands as multiple projectiles tore through their bodies. But there was no time to observe the results, because more soldiers were already taking their place, and the pump-action shotgun demanded constant feeding to maintain its devastating rate of fire. Working the Winchester's action with mechanical precision, learned through countless hours of training, Henderson ejected the spent shell and chambered a fresh round in less than 2 seconds, bringing the weapon back to his shoulder just as another group of Japanese soldiers reached the optimal killing range. His second shot took down 2 more attackers, while Marines to his left and right opened fire with their own weapons, rifles cracking, machine guns chattering, and more shotguns adding their thunder to the growing crescendo of defensive fire. But what struck Henderson most powerfully was not the sound of American weapons, but the sudden change in Japanese voices, as battle cries transformed into screams of pain and shock when the attackers encountered firepower unlike anything their training had prepared them to face. The charge that should have reached American positions within seconds instead ground to a halt in the face of concentrated shotgun fire that created an impenetrable barrier of flying lead. Japanese soldiers, who had trained their entire military careers to overcome enemy resistance through spiritual determination, found themselves facing weapons that made individual courage and martial skill irrelevant. Henderson watched through the smoke and muzzle flashes as attacking formations simply disintegrated, soldiers falling in groups rather than individually, their carefully planned assault dissolving into chaos and retreat as survivors realized they were running into a meat grinder rather than a conventional defensive position. Private Tommy Rodriguez, positioned in a foxhole 20 yards to Henderson's right, was firing his own M1897 with deadly effectiveness against Japanese soldiers who were trying to flank the main American position. His shooting background as a duck hunter from Louisiana had taught him to lead moving targets and adjust for range automatically, skills that translated perfectly to combat situations where enemy soldiers were moving rapidly across uneven terrain. Rodriguez's shotgun boomed repeatedly as he tracked individual targets. Each shot followed immediately by the sight of attacking soldiers stumbling and falling as multiple pellets found their marks. The weapon's spread pattern meant that even near misses were often effective, wounding attackers and disrupting their advance even when direct hits were not achieved. The psychological impact of shotgun fire on Japanese morale was visible almost immediately, as attacking soldiers began hesitating and seeking cover instead of maintaining their traditional aggressive advance. Henderson could hear changes in the enemy voices, The confident battle cries were being replaced by shouts of confusion and dismay as soldiers who had expected to engage in honorable bayonet combat instead found themselves being killed by weapons that seemed to violate traditional concepts of individual combat. Some Japanese soldiers began retreating without orders, their spiritual preparation for glorious death proving inadequate when confronted with the reality of being torn apart by multiple projectiles fired from weapons they had never encountered before. The second wave of the Japanese assault began 10 minutes after the first had been broken, with fresh soldiers advancing over the bodies of their comrades in an attempt to overwhelm American positions through sheer numerical superiority. But the Marines had used the brief respite to redistribute ammunition, clear weapon malfunctions, and adjust their positions to create even more effective fields of fire. Henderson had reloaded his shotgun and checked his ammunition supply. He still had 30 rounds of .00 buckshot, more than enough to break another assault if the Japanese were foolish enough to try the same tactics twice. The sound of approaching enemy voices suggested they were indeed planning to repeat their previous approach, apparently unable to conceive of tactical alternatives to direct frontal assault. This second assault lasted less than 5 minutes before Japanese commanders realized that their forces were being systematically destroyed without achieving any tactical objectives. Henderson's position alone accounted for over 20 enemy casualties, while the entire Marine perimeter had stopped the attacking force so decisively that surviving Japanese soldiers were already retreating back into the jungle before their officers could organize a tactical withdrawal. The shotguns had created a killing zone so effective that traditional Japanese tactics were simply impossible to execute, forcing enemy forces to choose between certain death and tactical retreat, a choice that violated everything they had been taught about military honor and spiritual obligation to their emperor. The aftermath of the assault revealed the devastating effectiveness of American shotgun tactics in jungle warfare conditions. The ground in front of Marine positions was littered with Japanese casualties, most of them bearing wounds characteristic of multiple projectile impacts rather than single rifle bullets. Henderson counted the bodies visible from his position and estimated that shotgun fire had accounted for at least 60% of enemy casualties, despite shotgun-armed Marines representing less than 20% of the defensive force. The weapons had proven their effectiveness not only through sheer killing power, but also through their psychological impact on attacking forces who had never encountered such devastating close-range firepower. Word of the shotgun's effectiveness spread rapidly through American forces as Marines shared accounts of the night's action with other units throughout the Guadalcanal perimeter. Henderson and his fellow shotgun-armed Marines found themselves treated as heroes who had demonstrated the superiority of American ingenuity over Japanese fanaticism, proof that democratic soldiers armed with practical weapons could defeat any enemy regardless of their spiritual preparation or tactical determination. The psychological boost to American morale was enormous, providing evidence that Japanese night attacks could be stopped decisively rather than merely survived through superior numbers or defensive positions. Captured Japanese soldiers, when interrogated about the assault, expressed shock and dismay at American use of weapons they described as unfair and dishonorable in the context of military combat. Several prisoners specifically mentioned the psychological impact of shotgun fire, describing the terror of watching multiple comrades fall simultaneously to single shots fired by weapons that seemed to violate traditional concepts of individual marksmanship and honorable combat. One Japanese officer reportedly stated that American shotguns made traditional bayonet charges impossible, forcing Japanese forces to abandon tactics that had been successful throughout their expansion across the Pacific Islands. The success of shotgun tactics at Guadalcanal led to immediate requests from Marine commanders for additional weapons and ammunition to equip more soldiers with these devastatingly effective tools for jungle warfare. Reports sent to higher headquarters described shotguns as potentially decisive weapons for Pacific operations, capable of stopping Japanese assault tactics that had previously required massive expenditures of ammunition and casualties to defeat. The practical effectiveness of these simple, brutal weapons had exceeded all expectations, proving that sometimes the most basic military tools could be more effective than sophisticated technological solutions in specific combat environments. Japanese radio communications intercepted after the failed assault revealed the profound impact that shotgun encounters were having on enemy morale and tactical planning. Imperial Army commanders were reporting that American defensive positions had become significantly more dangerous, with casualty rates from assault operations increasing dramatically without corresponding gains in tactical effectiveness. Some Japanese units were beginning to request modifications to traditional assault tactics, acknowledging that direct frontal attacks against American positions equipped with shotguns were no longer viable military options. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese tactical thinking that would influence their approach to combat operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The psychological transformation of American forces following the successful defense against Japanese banzai charges was immediate and profound, creating a surge of confidence that extended far beyond the soldiers who had actually witnessed shotgun effectiveness in combat. Marines throughout the Guadalcanal perimeter began requesting transfer of shotgun-armed soldiers to their units, recognizing that these weapons provided a decisive advantage in the close-quarters jungle fighting that characterized Pacific operations. Word spread through informal channels faster than official reports could travel, with stories of single Marines stopping multiple Japanese attackers, creating a mythology around shotgun capabilities that enhanced their psychological impact on both American and enemy forces. The medical consequences of shotgun wounds created unprecedented challenges for Japanese medical personnel who had never encountered injuries caused by multiple projectiles fired simultaneously from close range. Japanese military doctors reported wound patterns that were unlike anything in their medical training, with soldiers suffering multiple penetrating injuries that were difficult to treat effectively with limited medical supplies and field surgical capabilities. The psychological impact on Japanese medical staff was significant, as they struggled to understand how American weapons could cause such devastating injuries to soldiers who had been trained to accept death with honor, but not to suffer prolonged agony from wounds that defied traditional medical treatment. American intelligence services quickly recognized the strategic value of shotgun psychological warfare. As intercepted, Japanese communications revealed the profound impact these weapons were having on enemy morale and tactical planning. Reports from captured documents and prisoner interrogations indicated that Japanese commanders were beginning to modify traditional assault tactics specifically to avoid encounters with American shotgun-armed positions. This intelligence confirmed that the weapons were achieving strategic effects beyond their immediate tactical value, forcing enemy forces to adopt less effective approaches to combat that reduced their overall military effectiveness across the entire Pacific theater. The logistical implications of expanded shotgun deployment created significant challenges for American supply operations in the Pacific, as these weapons required specialized ammunition that was heavier and bulkier than standard rifle cartridges. Each 12-gauge shell weighed approximately 1 ounce, compared to less than half an ounce for M1 Garand ammunition, meaning that shotgun-equipped Marines required different supply calculations and transportation priorities. Additionally, the weapons consumed ammunition at much higher rates than rifles during combat operations, with some Marines firing 30 or more shells during single engagements that might have required only 8 rifle rounds from an M1 Garand. Japanese propaganda responses to reports of American shotgun use revealed the profound psychological impact these weapons were having on imperial military culture and public morale. Official Japanese military communications began describing American shotguns as examples of Western barbarity and disregard for honorable combat traditions, claiming that these weapons violated international laws governing warfare and represented evidence of democratic decadence and moral weakness. However, these propaganda efforts were undermined by their own acknowledgement of shotgun effectiveness, inadvertently confirming to Japanese soldiers that American forces possessed weapons capable of stopping traditional assault tactics. The formal Japanese protest regarding American shotgun use, submitted through neutral diplomatic channels, represented an unprecedented acknowledgement of weapon effectiveness by enemy forces who had never before complained about Allied military equipment or tactics. The protest claimed that shotguns violated Hague Convention provisions regarding expanding bullets and inhumane weapons, despite the fact that shotgun pellets did not technically qualify as expanding ammunition under international law. American military lawyers quickly dismissed these complaints as propaganda attempts to restrict effective American weapons through legal technicalities rather than legitimate concerns about international humanitarian law. Training modifications throughout American Pacific forces reflected the rapid recognition of shotgun tactical value, with specialized courses developed to teach Marines optimal techniques for close-quarters combat using pump-action weapons. These training programs emphasize the importance of rapid reloading, ammunition conservation, and coordination with other weapon systems to maximize shotgun effectiveness while avoiding the limitations imposed by slow rates of fire and limited ammunition capacity. Most importantly, training stressed the psychological advantages of shotgun use, teaching Marines to exploit the fear and confusion these weapons created among enemy forces. The industrial response to shotgun success involved rapid expansion of military production contracts with civilian firearms manufacturers who had the capacity to produce large quantities of pump-action weapons and ammunition. Companies like Winchester, Remington, and Ithaca received priority contracts to convert civilian production lines to military specifications, creating standardized versions of hunting shotguns that met military durability and reliability requirements. This industrial mobilization demonstrated the advantages of having a civilian firearms industry that could be rapidly converted to military production when specific weapons proved effective in combat operations. Medical reports from American field hospitals documented the positive psychological effects of shotgun success on wounded Marines who had participated in successful defensive actions against Japanese assaults. Soldiers who had witnessed shotgun effectiveness reported higher morale, greater confidence in American military capabilities, and reduced anxiety about future combat operations. These psychological benefits translated into faster recovery times, better cooperation with medical treatment, and higher rates of return to combat duty among Marines who had been wounded during shotgun-supported defensive actions. The ripple effects of shotgun success extended to other Pacific operations, as commanders throughout the theater requested additional weapons for their units based on reports from Guadalcanal. This demand created supply chain pressures that forced prioritization decisions about which units would receive shotguns first, generally favoring Marines and soldiers engaged in jungle warfare where close-quarters combat was most likely. The success also influenced weapon development priorities, With increased research into improved shotgun designs and specialized ammunition types optimized for military rather than civilian use. Japanese tactical adaptations to counter American shotgun effectiveness began appearing in intelligence reports within weeks of the first major encounters, indicating the speed with which enemy forces were attempting to modify their traditional approaches to combat. These adaptations included increased use of indirect fire weapons, longer-range engagement tactics, and attempts to avoid the close-quarters combat situations where shotguns were most effective. However, these modifications often reduce the effectiveness of traditional Japanese tactics without providing adequate alternatives, creating a tactical dilemma that would persist throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The Winchester M1897 and M1912 shotguns represented mature technology that had been perfected through decades of civilian use and previous military applications, providing American forces with weapons that were both immediately effective and operationally reliable under combat conditions. Unlike experimental military weapons that often suffered from technical problems and manufacturing defects, these shotguns had been proven through extensive civilian hunting use and World War I trench warfare, ensuring that they would function properly when Marines needed them most. The weapon's simple mechanical design meant that field maintenance was straightforward and repairs could often be performed by unit armorers using basic tools and readily available replacement parts. The 12-gauge ammunition used in military shotguns provided devastating stopping power through the simple physics of multiple projectiles delivered simultaneously at close range, creating wound patterns that were far more effective than single rifle bullets in stopping attacking enemies. Standard military loads contained 9 .33 caliber lead pellets, each weighing approximately 54 grains and traveling at velocities exceeding 1,200 feet per second when fired from military-length barrels. At ranges under 50 yards, these pellets maintained sufficient energy to penetrate human tissue and create incapacitating wounds, while the spread pattern ensured that multiple hits were probable even when precise aim was difficult to achieve in combat conditions. Comparative analysis between shotguns and other close-quarters weapons revealed significant advantages in stopping power and psychological impact that made them ideal for specific tactical situations encountered in Pacific jungle warfare. Thompson submachine guns, while providing higher rates of fire, used smaller .45 caliber pistol ammunition that was less effective at stopping determined attackers and required more precise aim to achieve lethal hits. M1 carbines offered semi-automatic fire and larger magazine capacity, but used lightweight bullets that often failed to provide adequate stopping power against enemy soldiers who were advancing rapidly across short distances. Shotguns, by contrast, delivered multiple large-caliber projectiles with each shot, virtually guaranteeing immediate incapacitation of targets within effective range. The tactical integration of shotguns with other infantry weapons created combined arms approaches to close-quarters combat that maximized the strengths of different weapon systems while minimizing their individual limitations. Marines learned to position shotgun-armed soldiers at critical points in defensive perimeters where enemy breakthrough was most likely, supporting them with rifle-armed soldiers who could engage targets at longer ranges and provide covering fire during shotgun reload cycles. Machine guns provided sustained suppressive fire against approaching enemy formations, while shotguns delivered the final, decisive blows when attackers reached close-quarters combat range where traditional infantry weapons were less effective. The industrial advantages of shotgun production reflected broader American strengths in manufacturing flexibility and rapid production expansion that proved crucial throughout World War II. Civilian shotgun manufacturers could convert their production lines to military specifications much more quickly than companies producing entirely new weapon designs, allowing rapid increases in military shotgun availability without the lengthy development and testing cycles required for more complex military equipment. Additionally, the ammunition manufacturing infrastructure for shotgun shells was already established through civilian sporting goods production, providing immediate capacity for military ammunition production without requiring entirely new manufacturing facilities. The limitations of military shotguns were significant and influenced their tactical employment throughout Pacific operations, preventing them from becoming general-purpose infantry weapons despite their effectiveness in specific situations. The weapon's effective range was limited to approximately 50 yards under optimal conditions, making them useless for most infantry combat situations where engagement ranges exceeded shotgun capabilities. Ammunition was heavy and bulky compared to rifle cartridges, limiting the number of rounds individual soldiers could carry and requiring more frequent resupply operations. Most significantly, the weapon's slow rate of fire made them vulnerable during reload cycles when attacking enemies could advance rapidly without facing effective defensive fire. Research and development efforts focused on improving shotgun effectiveness led to experimentation with specialized military ammunition types designed to maximize stopping power and reduce limitations imposed by civilian sporting ammunition. Military specification shells included improved propellants that increased muzzle velocity, hardened pellets that retained more energy at extended ranges, and specialized loads optimized for different tactical situations. However, these improvements were incremental rather than revolutionary, as the basic physics of shotgun ballistics imposed fundamental constraints on range and effectiveness that could not be overcome through ammunition modifications alone. The psychological warfare implications of shotgun use extended beyond immediate tactical applications to influence broader strategic approaches to Pacific combat operations. American commanders recognized that weapons, which created fear and confusion among Japanese forces, could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their actual killing power, forcing enemy forces to modify traditional tactics that had been successful in earlier phases of Pacific expansion. This understanding led to increased emphasis on psychological factors in weapon selection and tactical planning, with commanders considering the morale impact of weapons alongside their purely military effectiveness in combat situations. Post-war analysis of shotgun effectiveness in Pacific operations revealed statistical data that validated American confidence in these weapons for specific tactical applications while confirming their limitations as general-purpose infantry arms. Combat reports indicated that shotgun-armed Marines achieved casualty rates per shot fired that were significantly higher than soldiers using conventional infantry weapons, particularly in jungle warfare, where most engagements occurred at ranges under 50 yards. However, these same reports showed that shotguns were ineffective in approximately 60% of combat situations where engagement ranges exceeded their optimal capabilities, confirming that they were specialized rather than universal military tools. The profound irony of the Pacific War's shotgun success lay in the revelation that one of America's most primitive weapons proved more decisive than many products of advanced industrial technology and sophisticated military engineering. In a conflict characterized by radar-guided naval guns, precision-manufactured aircraft, and complex logistical systems that spanned thousands of miles, the simple pump-action shotgun, essentially unchanged since its development for civilian hunting, became the weapon that Japanese forces feared most in close combat. The contrast was stark and historically significant. While American factories produced millions of technically advanced rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces, It was a basic 12-gauge shotgun that broke the psychological foundation of Japanese infantry tactics and forced fundamental changes in enemy combat doctrine. The human cost of this technological irony extended beyond immediate battlefield casualties to encompass the profound psychological trauma experienced by Japanese soldiers who encountered weapons that seemed to violate traditional concepts of honorable combat and individual martial prowess. Men who had been trained since childhood to believe that spiritual strength and personal courage could overcome any material disadvantage found themselves facing weapons that made these virtues irrelevant through sheer, brutal effectiveness. The shotgun's multiple projectiles transformed combat from individual contests of skill and determination into mechanical processes of destruction that left no room for heroism or honorable death in battle. The strategic implications of shotgun success revealed fundamental truths about the nature of warfare that extended far beyond the specific tactical situations where these weapons proved effective. The Pacific conflict demonstrated that military effectiveness often depended more on matching weapons to specific combat conditions than on developing the most advanced technology available. American forces succeeded not because they possessed superior weapons in all situations, but because they were willing to adapt their equipment and tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses and environmental conditions that favored simpler, more direct approaches to combat problems. The legacy of the Guadalcanal shotgun battles extended far beyond the immediate military results, establishing principles about weapon effectiveness and tactical adaptation that would influence American military thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The recognition that primitive weapons could be more effective than advanced technology in specific situations led to continued interest in shotgun applications for military operations, while the psychological warfare implications of weapon selection became permanent features of American strategic planning. Perhaps most importantly, the success demonstrated that victory in modern warfare often belonged not to those with the most sophisticated equipment, but to those who could identify the right tool for each specific job and employ it with maximum effectiveness. If you want more untold stories of World War II, subscribe now to WWW2 Secret Archives, where history's darkest secrets are revealed.